Hi guys, this is Jessica Havman, and I did my theory presentation on the trauma theory. I know that some of this stuff is kind of heavy, so I'm gonna go through it kind of slow just so that um I don't rush and miss things. So to begin, I thought it would be important to define trauma. So the definition of trauma has been consistently inclusive of the following elements. An identified event or series of events that is experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful, threatening, or overwhelming, and has lasting holistic effects on the individual's functioning. And then I'm going to kind of go through the history of the trauma theory. I kind of made it like a timeline from the beginning to where we are now. And I might say some of these names wrong, so I'm sorry. The relationship between trauma and mental illness was first investigated by the neurologist, I think you pronounce that Charcot, during the late 19th century. So in the 1880s, though, Freud, Brower, and Janet concluded that hysteria was caused by psychological trauma. They agreed that reactions to traumatic experiences produced an altered state of consciousness they called disassociation. And I feel like when we talk about trauma, disassociation is kind of a big and important piece. Janet, who was a student of Charcot, continued to study dissociative phenomena and traumatic memories. They investigated the influence of the patient's traumatic experiences on personality development and behavior. Also thought that this was kind of a wild fact. So, crisis intervention methods to address traumatic events have developed gradually through history and time, with the establishment of the first suicide hotline in 1902. I just thought that that was kind of wild that the suicide hotline was first founded in 1902. Throughout history, so during World War I, psychiatrists observed that soldiers were returning with shell shock syndrome, and then psychological first aid was first developed to help the soldiers overcome their symptoms of uncontrollable weeping and screaming, memory loss, paralysis, and the lack of responsiveness. So the goal of the first aid was to provide a short intervention that would help the soldiers recover and return to the front lines as soon as possible. Like this wasn't a long-term solution. So moving forward, the contemporary trauma theory developed following the 1942 Coconut Grove fire in Boston. During that fire, 493 people perished in a nightclub. Many of them were trampled to death. Following that tragedy, Dr. Lindman, who treated a number of the survivors, observed that they displayed common responses. So he began to theorize about normal grief reactions, including preoccupation with the loss of loved ones, identification with the deceased, expressions of guilt, hostility, and disorganization. The contemporary trauma theory has like 8 kind of pieces to it. So the first piece is that trauma is a real event. It's not a fantasy that takes place of real events, and it's not a fantasy that causes trauma. It's a real event. The experience is subjective, so everyone kind of views the experience of the traumatic event differently, I would say. And then the traumatic experience is composed of intrapsychic and interpersonal dynamic events. So intrapsychic kind of means like within the mind. So the traumatic experience is composed of things within the mind and different dynamic elements. The strongest factor is the introjection of the perpetrator's anxiety and guilt by the child. And introjection kind of means the adoption of ideas and attitudes of others. So the strongest factor is the adoption of the ideas and attitudes of others, but the perpetrator's anxiety and guilt by the child. Um, the fifth piece is the identification with the aggressor. The sixth piece is disassociation. The seventh piece is the realization of the pleasure principle in trauma. And the eighth piece being the post-traumatic condition. Since we're in a clinical diagnosis class, I thought it'd be kind of cool to introduce the DSM with my trauma theory. So psychological trauma and PTSD were included in the DSM until 1980 when returning Vietnam War veterans presented with severe symptoms and clearly needed prolonged psychological services. Together with advocates of battered women, rape victims, and abused children, clinicians brought their influence to the DSM-3 committees, and all of these groups were included under the diagnosis of PTSD in 1980. I just thought that was kind of wild how 1980 doesn't seem like that long ago, but throughout history there have been a lot of traumatic experiences. And then trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy is kind of the way to handle traumatic experiences. And so according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, TFCBT is a components-based treatment model that incorporates trauma-sensitive interventions with cognitive behavioral, family, and humanistic principles and techniques. TFCBT addresses the multiple domains of trauma impacts such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, behavior problems, attachment problems, cognitive problems, and just a few other problems. TFCBT includes skills for regulating affect behavior, thoughts, and relationships. I feel like a really important one is trauma processing and enhancing safety, trust, parenting skills, and family communication. And then I have two videos. So this first one was shared on the Blackboard site, and I'm just going to play a little bit more than half of it. If you didn't already see it on the Blackboard site, it's in my PowerPoint, just because I feel like as social workers, trauma-informed care is important. So I'm gonna play this video.
Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, "What's wrong with you?" I ask, "What happened to you?" Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
I just think that as social workers, we should be aware of traumas and just like how to handle them. And then I know it's been a lot and I've talked a lot about like um a lot of like heavy stuff. So I thought I would add this video about um this TED Talk about this man who I'm not gonna play the whole thing, I'm just gonna play a portion of it. And it just kind of talks about like the things that he has been through and what he did to cope and all of those things. So
What if I told you that you could overcome anything? If there's a circumstance or situation known to man that you cannot overcome, that you are indeed unbreakable. Would you believe me? And more importantly than me telling you, if you told yourself those things, would you believe you? I want to talk to you about a critical element of happiness, success, and overcoming obstacles: resilience, and how it's built through some of the most painful moments. I'm not sure what the ideal route to a TED Talk is, but I'm guessing that my journey isn't it. I was born and raised in Oakland, California, coming of age in the 1980s, and it's nearly 20% unemployment rate for Blacks, systemic housing segregation and discrimination, education inequities, high poverty and murder rates, and the dawn of the crack epidemic and its partner, the war on drugs, that made historical criminal justice inequities even worse. Against that backdrop, I also came of age with a mother who would become an addict and a father who, though his listed occupation on my birth certificate says custodian, he was also a pimp. Despite their flaws and doing the best that they could in a situation that exploited the worst of themselves, I knew that my parents loved me to pieces, and I loved them to pieces. My mom had custody of me as we moved and settled into Acorn housing projects in West Oakland. It's during a 3-year period between age 7 and 10 years old that some of the most traumatic yet vivid moments of my childhood would play out as my mother's disease of addiction took root. When I close my eyes, I see them all just as clearly today as they happened decades ago. Like the time I discovered my mother's boyfriend, eyes wide open, laying on the floor of a drug overdose. A discovery that initially paralyzed me in fear, much in the same way that his body lay motionless at my feet as he blankly stared at the ceiling. Like the day my mother sat me down on my bed to read me a handwritten letter that my dad had written and sent me in the mail. It would be the first time I'd ever heard the 5-syllable word incarcerated and learned what it meant. Like the day my grandmother, who took over raising me when we were evicted out of the projects due to my mother's addiction, received a call to inform me that my father, after being jumped in a prison fight, was brain dead. He would die later that night before I ever saw him again alive. like the times I would later visit my own mother in jail. A hazy plexiglass window separating us physically and emotionally, while also serving to remind me of the fate that my father met in those very walls. I felt the pain, the sadness, the shame, the solitude, the adjectives that as a preteen meet the clinical definitions of depression. Yet when I opened my eyes, the worst of life couldn't take out the best of me, because I'm still standing here in front of you. Despite being truly disadvantaged, I stand here in front of you having overcome all those things and more. I would emerge as the first in my family to graduate college, earning undergraduate and master's business degrees, then on to a nearly 2-decade corporate career before starting my own venture. I've been from the projects to exploring a couple dozen countries across the world. From poverty to being the furthest from broke and broken that I've ever been. From tragedy to triumph, I have overcome, and even already, I have succeeded. Now, I could entertain and engross you in a fascinating story of how, but that's not nearly as important as a different question. Why? Why do I and others still succeed and flourish despite immense pain and trauma? Those people and myself, they aren't just strong or thick-skinned or good at compartmentalizing. What they are is resilient. You see, change, it's a constant in life. Nothing gives us immunity from it. Resilience is the capacity to adapt to negative change and recover from it as quickly as possible. Now, note that I said negative change. You typically don't need any help in coping with positive change, right? You get the job that you interviewed for and it comes with a 30% pay increase. Or you find out class is canceled the day that you have an exam that you haven't prepared for. Oh, it's a bunch of A students in here, right? It's just me. Okay. Well, those are really good things. And so you don't need any help or strategies on how to cope with the good fortune. It's the negative things, the hurtful things, the bad things in life where our level of resilience matters. How we process, respond to, and act will have huge implications on where the story goes from there. Whether we succumb to it or we surmount it. But understand, to exercise resilience, some change in circumstances must have happened. Some change in circumstances must have happened. The idea is to understand your belief system. Your beliefs impact your feelings. Your feelings impact how you think about things, and your thoughts ultimately impact how you act and respond.
So I'm gonna pause it there. I just thought that I know that trauma is a lot to learn about and take on. So I just thought it was interesting how he, a man who has experienced so much trauma, has still continued to be resilient. So that is the end of my presentation. I did put all of my citations on the side in little comments boxes. So I hope you guys learned something. And And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you.